The little girl dragged a torn burlap sack across the frozen street, her tiny bare feet sinking into the biting snow. 7-year-old Lila Holloway, wearing nothing but a tattered red coat, shivered beneath the brutal North Hollow winter. Her tangled hair stuck to her tear-streaked face, her hands raw and cracked from the cold as she searched through piles of broken bottles and rusted cans, hoping to find enough scraps to trade for a single loaf of bread and medicine for her sick baby brother. From the butcher shop, Mrs. Mullins's sharp voice pierced the bitter morning air. "Get out of here, Holloway kid! Take your filth somewhere else." Lila said nothing. She lowered her head, clutching the sack tighter, dragging it through the snow while whispers chased her like shadows. "That's the fire, girl. Her family cursed this town." Around her, the city moved on, doors slammed, windows shut, and no one stopped to help. Her tiny frame disappeared into the storm, swallowed by the endless white. But in a town that had turned its back on her, who would save the little girl in the red coat before it was too late? The morning broke over North Hollow, beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. Heavy snow clouds rolling like a lid pressed tight over the quiet streets. Bitter winds swept through the alleys, carrying a sting that cracked lips and bit exposed skin, while the frost lay thick across rooftops and the cobbled road, muffling every sound except the scrape of wood on ice. 7-year-old Lila Holloway moved slowly, dragging a burlap sack nearly as tall as her, the coarse rope cutting into her red-chapped palms. She wore nothing but a tattered red coat, the fabric frayed at the seams and split at the elbows, a coat far too thin for a North Hollow winter. Her bare feet pressed into the snow until her soles turned pale purple, each step leaving a faint bloody print against the white. Her hair, once light chestnut, now hung in greasy tangles around her face, strands stiffened by the frost. The child's eyes, a dull hazel that might have been bright in another life, stared at the ground with the hollow focus of someone who had learned too early that looking up only invited cruel stares. She collected scraps from the street, bent nails, rusted cans, splintered wood, not because she wanted to, but because hunger demanded it. The townspeople knew her. Everyone did. And they whispered with voices sharp as icicles whenever she passed. Some muttered that she carried the curse of her father, Daniel Holloway, the firefighter accused of starting the blaze that had consumed the council's records hall 5 winters ago. Others didn't bother to whisper. "There she goes, the fire girl," a man hissed as he pulled his son closer, his fur-lined coat pristine against the gray day. The boy stared at Lila with wide blue eyes, then turned his head quickly as his father instructed. From the butcher's shop came the voice of Mrs. Mullins, a woman with a hawk's nose and a heavy body wrapped in thick woolen shawls. She had run her business for 30 years, and her gossip longer. Her voice rang across the square. "Don't you dare drag that filthy sack near my door, girl. Take your cursed shadow somewhere else." Mrs. Mullins was not a cruel woman by nature. Her arms had rocked her own grandchildren many winters ago. But the fire had taken more than buildings. It had left suspicion and a wound of blame, and she, like many others, poured her bitterness upon the Holloway name. Lila did not reply. She bent lower, thin shoulders trembling, dragging the sack along the frosted stone. Inside were bits of splintered chair legs, bottles with chipped necks, and a piece of bent copper pipe she hoped might fetch enough for bread. Each item clattered as the sack scraped against the ice, and the sound was a miserable song that followed her through the market. Her lips moved as if whispering, though no words came out. Perhaps she was counting steps, or perhaps she was praying to no one in particular. Her little brother, Noah, only 4, lay sick in the cabin by the edge of the forest, coughing until his ribs shook. She could not fail him. A group of boys older than her leaned against the bakery wall. They were not hardened men, but children born into homes with warm hearths and mothers who brushed their hair before church. The tallest one, with freckles scattered across his nose, pointed at her with mockery glinting in his pale gray eyes. "There goes the devil's daughter," he laughed, and the others joined, throwing clumps of snow that splattered against her back. She flinched but did not stop, her silence enraging them more than tears ever could. They hurled curses as sharp as the cold, but Lila pressed on, dragging the sack like a soldier bearing a wounded comrade. By the corner of Main Street, her cart, an old wooden board with 2 crooked wheels, snapped under the weight. The axle cracked with a pitiful squeal, and the entire sack collapsed, scattering its meager contents across the snow. A shard of glass slid to the feet of Mrs. Mullins, brushing her polished boots. She bent, scowling, scooped water from a basin, and flung it straight into Lila's face. The freezing splash stung her skin, mixing with grime, dripping down her neck into the collar of her ragged coat. Lila gasped softly, but still said nothing. She knelt, scraped her hands along the ice to gather each piece, and when a sliver of wood tore her skin, she clutched it against her chest, not for healing, but for warmth. All around, the town watched. Doors closed, shutters slammed, feet shuffled quickly past, as if she were invisible. A young woman with honey-colored hair, carrying a basket of bread, stepped forward as though to help, then faltered beneath Mrs. Mullins's glare and retreated into her shop. Lila's chest rose and fell with short bursts, her body too fragile for the weight she bore, yet she gathered the pieces with the precision of someone who had done it too many times. Her thoughts were not of herself. If I don't bring something back, Noah won't eat. If I stop, he won't last. 15 minutes later, her sack reassembled and bound with a strip of torn cloth, she staggered to her feet. The world tilted, her vision blurred, and she stumbled forward, catching herself with trembling hands. No one reached for her. To them, she was a shadow better left alone. Snow swirled, clinging to her lashes, but she dragged onward, a small red figure swallowed by white. At that moment, on the outskirts of the square, a man walked with heavy, deliberate steps, his boots crunching against the frost. His name was Caleb Rourke, a 45-year-old veteran of 2 tours overseas. His body tall and broad-shouldered, though wearied by years of conflict. His hair, once dark, was streaked with gray at the temples, and a short beard clung to his angular jaw, dusted with flakes of snow. His blue-gray eyes were set deep, carrying a weight that made strangers look twice, but never ask questions. Caleb wore a simple parka and thick gloves, though his posture betrayed tension, as if he never truly escaped the battlefield. The war had left him with scars that no bandage could bind, memories that woke him at night, the echo of gunfire, the cries of men left behind. He had come to North Hollow seeking solitude, but even in silence, the ghosts walked beside him. At his side padded Rex, a German shepherd of 5 years, his coat a handsome blend of black and tan. The dog moved with the alert grace of a soldier himself, ears pricked forward, amber eyes scanning every corner as if danger lurked even in the snow. Rex bore a faint notch on his right ear, a scar from training days, but his stride was steady, protective, loyal. Where Caleb's heart faltered under shadows, Rex carried light. He was both guardian and companion, the only soul Caleb trusted completely. As Caleb crossed into the square, his gaze caught the sight of the small figure in red collapsing near the broken cart. He slowed, every instinct sharpened. Rex gave a low growl, not of menace but of recognition, of suffering, of distress. The dog pulled gently at the leash, urging his master closer. Caleb's eyes fixed on the child, her body half buried in snow, the sack spilled once more, her tiny hands trembling against the cold. Around them, the town did nothing, as if carved from ice themselves. Caleb felt his chest tighten, a memory stirring. Another child, another fire, another time he had been too late. Rex barked once, sharp and commanding, the sound cracking through the silence of the market. Heads turned, doors opened, but Caleb saw only the girl. He stepped forward, boots pressing into the snow, the soldier and his dog drawn inexorably toward the fallen child in the red coat. And in that moment, the bitter indifference of North Hollow met the unyielding will of a man who had once sworn never to leave anyone behind again. The chapter closed on that frozen instant as the soldier halted before the child, and Rex's growl deepened into the kind of sound that said, "This story is no longer just hers, it is ours." Caleb dropped to one knee, snow crunching beneath his weight as he reached the little girl. Her tiny frame was limp, her breath shallow, lashes frozen with white crystals that clung stubbornly to her pale cheeks. Without a word, he slid his arms beneath her, feeling the bones beneath the thin layers of her tattered red coat. The weight of her frail body struck him like a punch. This child barely weighed as much as Rex's training harness. Her forehead was cold, too cold, and for an instant he feared she might not wake at all. He wrapped her gently in a thick wool blanket from his pack, tucking it around her small shoulders. Rex circled once, positioning himself between Caleb and the gathering stares of the silent crowd, his ears forward, hackles raised just slightly. The German shepherd let out a low, steady growl, not threatening but protective, making a barrier between Lila and the cold-eyed indifference of North Hollow. Caleb lifted her carefully, his broad shoulders leaning into the bitter wind, and carried her to the battered green truck parked at the edge of the square. As he lowered her into the passenger seat, his gaze fell on her neck, where the frayed collar of the coat had slipped aside. His breath hitched. There, just beneath her jawline, lay a crescent-shaped scar, faint but sharp under the pale skin. A memory hit him like shrapnel, the fire 5 years ago, the one that tore through the council's archives. He could still hear the screams, smell the acrid smoke, feel the oppressive heat. That night, his wife Emily and their daughter Grace had been trapped inside a neighboring building when the flames spread. Caleb had run until his lungs gave out, but he had been too late. Grace. Grace had worn a pendant shaped like a crescent moon, and he remembered pulling her tiny body from the wreckage, the heat searing his palms. A similar mark burned into her delicate skin where the chain had melted. Now, staring at this little girl, the scar carried him back into that same night, into questions he'd buried deep because the answers had always been too heavy to bear. He inhaled sharply, pushing the thought down, forcing himself back to the present. "Stay with me, kid," he muttered under his breath, glancing toward Rex, who responded with a soft whine, as though sharing the weight of his unease. Caleb drove out of the square, the tires crunching over hard-packed snow. They passed shuttered shops and narrow streets lined with drifting white, each dark window another reminder of the town's silence. Every so often he glanced at the passenger seat. Lila stirred faintly, tiny fingers gripping the wool edge, her lips moving soundlessly as though calling a name he couldn't hear. 10 minutes later, they pulled into a secluded area on the outskirts of North Hollow, where an abandoned field hospital stood beneath a grove of skeletal pine trees. The building was a remnant from wartime decades past. Its stone walls cracked, windows frosted over, but Caleb had restored one wing to make it livable. To him, it was more than shelter. It was distance from the world and its noise, a quiet place where he could breathe without the weight of others' judgment pressing against him. Inside, the space was simple, but warm. A cast-iron stove glowed faintly in the corner, its orange embers pushing back the winter chill. Shelves lined the far wall, stocked sparsely with canned goods and medical supplies, tools from years of survival rather than comfort. Against one wall stood a sturdy oak desk, worn by time, papers scattered across it. Old field reports Caleb had never managed to throw away. He placed Lila on a small cot layered with blankets. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, but her color was returning. Rex sat by the cot's edge, his large paws stretched forward. Amber eyes focused on her like a silent guardian. Caleb knelt beside the bed, checking her pulse, the tension in his jaw tightening when he felt the faint, uneven rhythm beneath his fingertips. Moments later, as he unfastened her coat, something small slid from an inner pocket and landed on the wooden floor with a soft metallic clink. Caleb froze, his hand pausing mid-air. He reached down and picked it up. It was an old bronze firefighter's badge, worn smooth by time, its engraving dulled but still legible. Daniel Holloway, Glenmore Fire Department. Caleb's chest tightened, the pieces clicking together one by one. Daniel Holloway. The name had been dragged through the dirt ever since the fire 5 years ago. The official report had branded him the arsonist, claiming he had started the blaze that destroyed the town's archives and killed 3 people. But that had never sat right with Caleb. Not then, not now. Daniel had been one of the few men Caleb trusted during emergency response drills, steady hands, sharp instincts, the kind who ran toward danger rather than away from it. And now this badge, hidden in the pocket of a starving little girl wandering the streets. Lila stirred slightly, her lashes trembling as she opened her hazel eyes. They flickered briefly, unfocused, until they landed on Rex. She blinked, her thin fingers moving slowly toward the dog's fur, hesitating as if unsure she was allowed to touch him. Rex leaned closer, pressing his warm muzzle against her palm. For the first time since Caleb had seen her, a faint breath of relief escaped her lips. Caleb leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Lila, is that your name?" She nodded slightly, her breath shaky, but didn't speak. Her small frame shivered despite the warmth of the blankets, and he resisted the urge to press her with questions. As she drifted back into a shallow sleep, Caleb sat back heavily, the weight of the badge cold in his hand. That fire had taken everything from him, his family, his peace, and now he had the sickening sense it had taken from this little girl too. But there was more to it, something deeper than just tragedy. Her scar, her father's badge, the way the entire town recoiled from her family's name. None of it was coincidence. He rubbed a hand over his face, pushing the memories away. That night had been ruled an accident after only a 3-day investigation. Too fast. Too clean. The mayor at the time, Luther Grant, a tall, sharp-featured man in his early 50s with slicked-back silver hair and a reputation for being both charming and ruthless, had insisted the town move forward. Caleb remembered his cold, gray eyes at the press briefing, the thin smile he gave reporters, and the way he'd shut down anyone who dared ask why Holloway had been the sole suspect. Caleb had been too consumed by grief to fight back then. But now, holding this badge, he felt the first stirrings of anger beneath the numbness that had ruled him for years. Rex shifted beside him, resting his head on Caleb's knee, amber eyes steady, as though reading his thoughts. Caleb glanced down at his companion and murmured, "Maybe this isn't over after all, buddy." A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the loose shutters. Lila turned in her sleep, murmuring softly, and a single name slipped past her lips. Noah. Caleb's brows drew together. He hadn't heard that name before, but he understood enough. There was someone else, someone still out there, depending on her. And deep in his chest, under the steady rhythm of Rex's breathing, Caleb felt it. The old promise rising again. The one he had failed 5 years ago. He would not fail this time. The chapter closes as Caleb, holding Daniel Holloway's tarnished badge, looks once more at the little girl asleep beneath the faded blankets, his gaze heavy with unspoken resolve. Outside, the winter pressed in. But inside the dim field hospital, something had shifted. A soldier, a scar, and a truth buried deep in the snow. Lila woke to the soft creak of the old field hospital's cot, her hazel eyes clouded with confusion before awareness flooded back. She sat up suddenly, the blanket slipping from her frail shoulders, her breath uneven as panic took hold. "Noah," she whispered, voice hoarse, then louder. "I have to get to Noah." Her small hands clutched Caleb's sleeve with unexpected strength for someone so weak. Caleb, seated on a wooden chair nearby, with Rex resting at his boots, leaned forward and placed a steady hand over hers. His blue-gray eyes softened, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his concern. "Lila, slow down. Who's Noah?" She blinked rapidly, trying to find her voice. "My little brother. He's 4. He's sick. He can't breathe when it's cold." Her trembling fingers twisted the frayed hem of her red coat. "I left him alone. Please, mister. Please, we have to go." Caleb hesitated only a moment before nodding once. "All right," he said, his tone quiet but firm, the same tone he'd once used when giving orders in the field. "We'll bring him here." He rose, grabbing his heavy jacket, and Rex followed instantly, ears perked and muscles taut, ready to move. The drive through North Hollow's outskirts was slow, the truck's headlights cutting narrow tunnels into the swirling snow. Lila sat between Caleb and Rex, her thin body shivering beneath the blanket, eyes fixed on the blurred outlines of the forest ahead. After 20 minutes, they reached a narrow path buried beneath drifts of white. Caleb parked and helped Lila down, boots crunching softly as they approached a small wooden cabin at the edge of the pine forest. The structure sagged with age, its roof patched with mismatched boards, walls warped and stained from years of water damage. The chimney stood crooked, smoke long since absent, and frost crawled up the edges of the cracked window panes like veins of ice. When they stepped inside, the air was stale and cold, the single-room interior dimly lit by the faint gray light filtering through thin curtains. The smell of damp wood and old ash hung heavy. In the corner, a tiny bed sat close to a crumbling brick fireplace, and on it lay a boy, his breathing shallow and erratic. Noah Holloway was 4 years old, his frame so small that the thin blanket barely rose over his chest. His skin was pale, lips cracked and tinged blue, curls of sandy blonde hair clinging damply to his forehead. When Caleb crouched beside him, Noah's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing irises of pale green dulled by fever. He tried to sit up, but immediately fell back with a soft cough that tore at his chest. Caleb's expression hardened, not in anger, but in resolve. Years of combat had taught him to read danger fast, and Noah's labored breathing screamed of it. He brushed cold fingers gently across the boy's forehead, finding heat where there should have been none. He glanced toward Lila, who knelt beside the bed, tears streaking dirt down her cheeks as she whispered soft reassurances to her brother. While scanning the room, Caleb's gaze landed on a small wooden table against the wall. Among scattered scraps of paper, broken pencils, and an overturned ceramic cup lay an envelope, yellowed at the edges. He picked it up carefully, the handwriting faded but delicate, shaky yet purposeful. "If I am gone, please, someone take care of my children. Daniel is innocent." Caleb read it twice, the words sinking deep into the hollow space inside his chest. He looked up at Lila, who hugged her knees tightly. Her gaze lowered. "Your mother wrote this?" he asked softly. Lila nodded once, her voice barely audible. She died last winter." Her small shoulders quivered, but she didn't cry loudly. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Caleb clenched the paper in his hand, frustration pressing hard against his ribs. The same town that spat on these children's name had left them to starve, freezing, while Noah's condition worsened. Not just the town, the whole system. He had seen this kind of neglect before, in war zones where those without power were buried beneath bureaucracy. He knew what it meant to be forgotten. Rex padded closer to Noah's bed, the German shepherd lowering his massive head gently onto the mattress. Noah reached out weakly, his small hand resting on the dog's fur, and a faint smile touched his fever-chapped lips. Caleb felt something inside him shift. For 5 years, he had let the world close around his grief. But here, seeing this boy cling to warmth, watching his sister silently shoulder everything, something long buried stirred awake. He stood, slipping the letter into his jacket pocket. "We're taking him," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. Lila's head jerked up, fear flashing across her wide hazel eyes. "No," she whispered, shaking her head rapidly. "We can't. If they see us, if they know—" Caleb crouched down in front of her, meeting her gaze. "Lila, if we leave him here, he won't make it through the night." His voice softened, though it carried the unshakable weight of truth. She hesitated, her small hands clenching around the blanket, then finally gave a tiny nod. Caleb scooped Noah carefully into his arms, wrapping him snugly in the thickest quilt he could find. Noah stirred, but didn't protest, his cheek resting against Caleb's chest, as if it were the safest place he'd ever known. When they stepped outside, the wind howled like a living thing, carrying sharp flakes that stung exposed skin. Rex trotted ahead, head low, his tracks marking a path back toward the truck. Caleb glanced once over his shoulder at the leaning cabin, its single cracked window glinting faintly beneath the gray sky, and something about the silence there pressed against him like a weight. Back in the truck, he settled Noah on Lila's lap, tucking another blanket around them both. Lila hummed softly, a broken, shaky melody her mother had sung once, and Noah's breathing steadied slightly beneath the rhythm. Caleb kept his hands firm on the wheel as they drove toward the county hospital, knowing full well the risk of what he was about to do. North Hollow's medical board had long refused treatment to the Holloway children, a cruelty born from whispers and blame tied to Daniel's name. Caleb remembered clearly the bitter words from Mrs. Mullins and the others, their voices sharp with judgment, their eyes cold as stone. Taking Noah to the hospital meant challenging the town outright. But watching the boy's fragile chest rise and fall, Caleb knew there was no other choice. As the hospital came into view on the distant ridge, its pale concrete walls stark against the dark pines, Caleb felt the tension tighten in his shoulders. He slowed the truck, glancing at Lila. Her wide hazel eyes followed his, unblinking, clutching her brother close as though bracing for the fight to come. The chapter ends here, with the truck rolling toward the gates, a wounded boy cradled in his sister's arms, and a soldier silently preparing to confront a town's indifference head-on. Snow clung stubbornly to Caleb's boots as he stepped out of the county hospital into the bitter wind. his breath forming pale clouds beneath the gray North Hollow sky. Inside, Noah was finally admitted after a heated argument with the triage nurse, but Caleb knew they wouldn't keep him long without payment. Still, it gave the boy a fighting chance. Lila sat curled on a bench near the entrance, Rex pressed close against her side, his warm breath puffing gently against her arm. Caleb placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning away, his jaw tight. He had work to do. The fire had stolen too many lives and buried too many truths. Now, armed with Daniel Holloway's badge and the faded letter, Caleb needed answers. He slid into his truck, the leather seat creaking beneath his weight, and started the engine. His first stop was a rundown repair shop on the south side of town, its sagging roof weighed down with a blanket of snow, windows fogged from within. The faded wooden sign above the door read, "Garrett's Metalworks," though most of the letters had chipped away. Caleb hadn't seen Garrett Myers in nearly 5 years, not since the fire. Back then, Garrett had been one of the lead firefighters, steady, dependable, known for taking risks others wouldn't. He'd been forced into early retirement after the investigation, though the town never talked about why. Caleb pushed open the door, the small brass bell above it jingling softly. The air inside smelled faintly of oil, steel, and burnt metal. Sparks hissed in the corner where a tall, broad-shouldered man hunched over a welding bench. Garrett's once jet-black hair had turned almost entirely gray, cropped close to his skull. His face was rugged and weathered, creased deeply from years of heat and smoke, with a short, scruffy beard framing a square jaw. His shoulders carried the weight of old battles, not the kind fought overseas, but the quiet wars men wage against guilt and silence. When he turned, his brown eyes were wary, shadowed by exhaustion, but sharp enough to assess Caleb in a heartbeat. "Well," Garrett rasped, pulling off his welding goggles, "if it isn't Rourke. Haven't seen you since, well, you know." Caleb nodded once, stepping closer, Rex at his heel. "I need to talk about that night." Garrett's jaw tightened as he leaned against the workbench, folding his soot-marked arms. 5 years, and not a damn person's asked me about that fire. Not once. "Maybe they didn't want the answers," Caleb said evenly, holding Garrett's gaze. He reached into his jacket and placed Daniel Holloway's firefighter badge on the bench. "I found this in his daughter's coat." Something shifted in Garrett's expression, his shoulders stiffening. He looked down at the badge, jaw working before he exhaled through his nose. "Lila, huh?" Caleb nodded. "She's 7 now. Living in a half-rotted cabin on the edge of the forest. Her brother's in the hospital, and the whole town's turned its back on them. You know why." Garrett turned away, rubbing the back of his neck, his broad frame hunched as if bracing against a weight pressing down from within. "I know why," he admitted quietly, "and I should have spoken up a long time ago." Caleb's voice sharpened, though he kept it low. "Then speak up now." Garrett hesitated, then crossed the shop to a locked steel cabinet in the corner. From his pocket, he drew an old brass key, worn smooth from years of use, and slid it into the lock. With a click, the door swung open, revealing a stack of sealed manila envelopes and rolled-up blueprints, all tied neatly with faded twine. He set them carefully on the bench and opened the top folder. Inside were original photographs from the fire, some burned along the edges, others coated in soot. He placed the images in front of Caleb, his calloused hands steady despite the storm behind his eyes. "The official report says the fire started in the storage archive. That's a lie. The blaze didn't begin there. It started in the administrative office." Caleb's brows furrowed. "The one that handled the city's finance records?" Garrett gave a grim nod. "Exactly. That office kept files on land transfers, payouts, relief funds. 5 years ago, the council was diverting millions into emergency development projects. Money never went where it was supposed to. Holloway stumbled onto something. That's why they made him the scapegoat." Caleb studied the photos, tracing his fingers along the blackened remains of the administrative wing. His throat tightened as Garrett handed him a rolled-up sheet of blue paper, the original blueprint of the archives building. Red ink circled a small room labeled Records Office. Next to it, in Garrett's jagged handwriting, read, "Ignition point, high ethanol levels reported." Caleb's voice came out low, measured. "You tried to bring this forward?" Garrett snorted bitterly. "The day after the fire, I took these photos straight to Chief Donnelly. He said if I didn't shut up, I'd lose my pension, my house, and whatever was left of my name. A week later, I was off the force. Who told Donnelly to bury it? Caleb pressed. Garrett's gaze hardened, meeting Caleb's. Luther Grant. That charming bastard came down himself. He shook my hand, thanked me for my service, and told me the best thing I could do for the town was disappear quietly. The name hung heavy in the cold air, mixing with the soft hum of the shop's heater. Luther Grant, the same mayor who had insisted on closing the case after a 3-day investigation. Caleb felt his fists clench unconsciously at his sides. A sudden shuffle sounded at the door, and both men turned sharply. A tall, slim woman stood hesitantly at the threshold, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. She had soft blonde hair tied back loosely beneath a knitted gray cap, and her long wool coat hung almost to her boots. In her arms was a leather satchel cradled against her chest. Her name was Nora Caldwell, a local investigative journalist known for her persistence and quiet tenacity. "Don't stop on my account," she said gently, her voice warm but edged with curiosity. Her blue-gray eyes scanned the table where the photographs and blueprints lay. "I heard about the Holloway kids. Figured I might find you here." Garrett sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Nora, this isn't a story for the papers." She stepped closer, setting her satchel down. "No, Garrett, it's not a story. It's a cover-up." Her gaze turned to Caleb. "If what he's saying is true, this isn't about one family. It's the entire council. The missing relief funds, the payouts, the erased ledgers, everything points to Luther Grant." Caleb remained silent for a long moment, his thumb brushing over the engraved letters on Daniel Holloway's badge. He thought of Lila shivering in his truck, Noah struggling for breath in that cabin, and the years they'd spent buried under whispers and lies. Finally, he lifted his gaze to Garrett and Nora both. "Then we find proof," he said flatly, his voice carrying the quiet steel of a man who had spent years giving orders under fire. Garrett nodded, sliding a heavy envelope across the bench. "Start with this. These are copies of the financial statements Luther tried to bury. But be careful, Caleb. Once you start pulling at this thread, there's no going back." Caleb took the envelope, tucking it beneath his coat as Rex shifted at his side, ears flicking at the sound of the wind rattling the shop's windows. Outside, the storm grew harsher, snow swirling in thick, relentless sheets. Inside the small metal shop, the truth was finally beginning to take shape. The chapter closes as Caleb steps out into the biting cold. Rex close beside him, his grip firm on the envelope holding Luther Grant's secrets. The soldier had spent 5 years drowning in silence, but now, for the first time, he felt the fire rising again. Not from the flames of tragedy, but from a promise to uncover everything buried beneath the snow. The storm had grown wilder by nightfall, snowflakes whipping in sharp spirals beneath the pale glow of North Hollow's street lamps. Caleb parked his truck in an alley 2 blocks away from the town hall, its engine idling softly before cutting to silence. The towering stone building loomed ahead, its Gothic-style windows faintly lit from within. Once a symbol of order and authority, it now felt like a fortress built to hide the truth. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his amber eyes locked on the building, tail still, body tense as if sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. Caleb adjusted his dark wool coat, pulling the hood low over his face, and checked the small flashlight strapped beneath his sleeve. He wasn't new to infiltration. His years as a special operations soldier had sharpened instincts that never dulled. Beside him, Nora Caldwell reviewed a folded sketch of the town hall's interior. Her face was pale beneath the glow of the dashboard, blue-gray eyes focused and unwavering. "The records room is in the sub-basement," she whispered. "Second door on the left after the service corridor. Security's minimal, but there are motion sensors near the archive hall." "I'll handle those," Caleb murmured. He turned to Rex, scratching gently behind his ears. "You stay sharp, boy." The German shepherd gave a quiet huff, his breath misting in the frigid air, ready. Inside the town hall, the corridors smelled faintly of wax and damp paper. The old building groaned with the cold, its wooden beams creaking under decades of strain. Caleb kept low, his boots silent on the marble floor. Nora followed close behind, clutching her leather satchel against her chest, her wool coat blending into the dim shadows. At the stairwell, they paused, listening for footsteps. From above came faint voices, two security guards, judging by the muffled laughter and the occasional scrape of boots. They waited until the sound receded, then descended into the sub-basement, where the stale air smelled of mold and forgotten files. The records room was marked "Authorized Personnel Only" in peeling gold letters. Caleb slipped a slim piece of metal into the old lock, his movements precise, and within seconds the door clicked open. He stepped inside, motioning Rex to sit by the door and watch the hallway. The room was colder than the corridors, the hum of an ancient ventilation system rattling faintly above. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes marked "Archives," "Confidential," in faded ink. Dust coated everything in a thin, undisturbed layer. But Caleb's attention was drawn to a small locked cabinet in the far corner, its metal surface newer than the rest. He crouched, examined the lock, then pulled a slender tool from his jacket. Within moments, it yielded. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, the deep brown cover etched with faint scuffs and creases, its spine nearly cracked with age. He opened it carefully, flipping through until he reached page 27. Written in bold red ink, underlined twice, were words that made his chest tighten. "Burn the records vault. Erase everything. Blame Holloway." LG. Caleb froze, his breath leaving in a slow, controlled exhale. Luther Grant hadn't just covered up financial corruption. He had ordered the destruction of evidence and ensured Daniel Holloway's name carried the stain of guilt. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the journal, fury curling low in his gut, mingled with the bitter ache of vindication. Nora leaned over his shoulder, her expression tightening as she read the passage. This is what we needed," she whispered. "This clears Daniel. It proves everything." Her voice wavered, though her gaze burned with renewed determination. Caleb slipped the journal into his coat and turned to leave, but Rex's sharp, low growl stopped him cold. The German shepherd stood rigid, ears pricked, body angled toward the doorway. A second later, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, deliberate and unhurried. The door swung open, revealing a tall man framed by the flickering fluorescent light of the corridor. Sheriff Doyle stepped inside, his silhouette cutting an imposing figure. He was in his late 50s, standing well over 6 feet, his broad frame filling the narrow doorway. His graying hair was cropped close, and a trimmed beard lined a jaw carved from granite. Deep-set eyes, the color of slate, studied Caleb with quiet calculation, and his dark sheriff's coat hung loosely from powerful shoulders. "Rourke," Doyle said flatly, his voice low, the sound heavy with restrained authority. Caleb straightened, shoulders squared, his hand unconsciously lowering to Rex's collar. "Doyle." The sheriff's gaze flicked to the journal peeking slightly from Caleb's coat, then back to his face. He didn't move, didn't reach for the radio at his belt, but the silence carried its own weight. Finally, Doyle spoke again, his tone measured. "You don't know what you're stepping into, soldier." Caleb's jaw clenched. "I know enough." Doyle stepped further into the room, boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. His expression remained impassive, but the faint shadow under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and burdens carried too long. "If you release what's in that book," he said evenly, "you won't just bring down Luther Grant. You'll bring down half the council, the funding network, every deal tied to this city's survival. North Hollow will collapse." For a moment, the room held only the sound of the humming ventilation and Rex's faint growl. Caleb met Doyle's gaze, unflinching. Then maybe it's time it did. The sheriff's lips pressed into a thin line, the flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. He studied Caleb for another beat, then exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering ever so slightly. "I'm not arresting you," Doyle said quietly. "Not tonight. But you need to understand. Once this storm starts, there's no stopping it." Caleb gave a single nod, not out of agreement but acknowledgement. He tucked the journal deeper into his coat, signaling Rex with a subtle hand gesture. The German shepherd padded to his side, muscles taut, amber eyes locked on Doyle until Caleb brushed a calming hand along his neck. Doyle stepped aside, clearing the doorway. "Get out of here, Rourke," he muttered, his voice rougher now. "But watch your back. Luther won't go down without drawing blood." Caleb left without another word. Nora close behind, her fingers clutching the strap of her satchel as though it anchored her against the weight of what they'd just uncovered. Outside, the storm howled around them, flurries cutting like glass against exposed skin. But Caleb didn't feel the cold. Back in the alley, he stopped, leaning against the truck for a moment, the journal clutched tightly in his gloved hand. Rex nudged his knee softly, sensing the heaviness pressing on his chest. Caleb looked down at the dog, his voice quiet but steady. "This isn't just about Daniel anymore, buddy. It's about all of them." The chapter closes as Caleb climbs into the truck, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Rex settled at his feet, and Nora silent in the back seat. Outside, the snowstorm raged on. But in Caleb's mind, the real storm had only just begun. The storm over North Hollow had calmed by morning, but the air carried a tense electric weight. Snowbanks lined the edges of Main Square, where townspeople slowly gathered, murmuring in low voices beneath the pale winter sun. A wooden podium stood at the center, hastily built but sturdy, a single microphone wired to portable speakers. At its base stood Caleb Rourke, shoulders squared beneath his dark coat, Rex sitting faithfully at his side, amber eyes scanning the crowd. Caleb's breath hung in small clouds as he gripped a folder in one gloved hand and the leather-bound journal of Luther Grant in the other. Beside him stood Nora Caldwell, wrapped in a long navy wool coat that brushed her boots. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose bun beneath a knitted cap, blue-gray eyes sharp and steady despite the crowd's restless energy. She held her leather satchel close, its contents carefully organized. The original fire scene photos, the audio recording of Garrett's confession, and copies of city financial records. Her calm presence anchored Caleb's silent resolve. Across the square, people stood bundled in heavy coats, scarves pulled tight against the cold. Among them were familiar faces. Mrs. Mullins, her stern expression softened into unease. A group of teenage boys who once mocked Lila now stood silent, shifting awkwardly. Curiosity and suspicion rippled through the gathered crowd, but beneath it all lay something unspoken. Fear of what Caleb might reveal. Caleb glanced down at Lila, who stood just a step behind him, clutching Rex's fur for comfort. Her tattered red coat looked almost fragile against the brightness of the snow. Her hazel eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting both anxiety and hope she couldn't yet name. Noah, still recovering, was wrapped in a blanket in the arms of Mrs. Green, an elderly nurse from the county hospital, who had volunteered to watch over him. Mrs. Green, a petite woman in her late 60s with soft silver hair pinned beneath a wool bonnet, had gentle gray eyes filled with quiet strength. She had watched too many children neglected by the city's indifference and refused to let these two be lost to it. Caleb stepped up to the podium, the wood creaking faintly under his boots. He looked out at the sea of faces, cold, guarded, expectant, and for a moment the weight of his grief threatened to crush him. He thought of Grace, his daughter, lost to the fire. He thought of Daniel Holloway, falsely condemned while trying to save lives. And then he thought of Lila, standing behind him, and the generations of silence that had buried the truth. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the square, deep and steady despite the icy air. 5 years ago, he began, the archives fire tore the city apart. It took my wife. It took my daughter. And it took the name of a good man, Daniel Holloway. A ripple moved through the crowd, whispers stirring like dry leaves in winter wind. Caleb raised the leather journal, holding it high. This is Luther Grant's personal log. Page 27, written in his own hand. Burn the records vault. Erase all evidence. Blame Holloway. Gasps broke from the front rows. Mrs. Mullins' hand flew to her mouth. Caleb didn't pause. He reached for the photographs, holding them up one by one for the crowd to see. These are the original images from the fire, hidden for 5 years. They show the ignition point here. He tapped the red-circled area on the blueprint pinned to the board beside him. In the administrative office, not the storage vault. Daniel Holloway was there, but he wasn't setting the fire. He was pulling people out. Rex barked once, loud and sharp, almost as if punctuating Caleb's words. Lila flinched but didn't let go of his fur, clutching tighter as her breaths quickened. Caleb nodded to Nora, who stepped forward and held up a small recorder. Garrett's gravelly voice spilled through the speakers, his confession raw and unpolished. I saw where it started. I saw who ordered the cover-up. I stayed silent because they threatened my family. But it wasn't Holloway. He ran into the fire, not away from it. Silence blanketed the square when the recording ended, broken only by the faint whine of the speakers. Caleb drew in a slow breath, looking directly at the people who had turned their backs on the Holloway children for years. "While you whispered curses," he said softly, "while you turned away from them in the streets, Lila and Noah were starving in a frozen cabin, alone, because you believed a lie." Lila's small hand gripped Rex tighter as her hazel eyes filled with tears. When Caleb spoke her father's name again, Daniel Holloway, her breath caught in her throat and a sob slipped free. She dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around Rex's neck, burying her face in his fur. The German shepherd leaned against her, his calm strength a silent promise she wasn't alone anymore. One by one, heads in the crowd began to lower. The teenage boys shifted uncomfortably, their earlier mocking replaced by guilt. Mrs. Mullins pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her lips quivering. Some people began to cry quietly, and others simply stared at the frozen ground, as though seeing their own reflections in the shards of truth scattered before them. Then came the commotion at the far end of the square. Two uniformed officers pushed through the crowd, followed by a tall man in a long black coat, Detective Harris, sent from the State Bureau after weeks of quiet rumors surrounding Luther Grant. Harris was in his early 40s, lean but sharp-shouldered, his chestnut brown hair neatly combed, piercing hazel eyes taking in everything with precise calculation. His reputation preceded him, relentless, methodical, and immune to the sway of local politics. Behind him, Luther Grant appeared, face pale beneath his expensive wool coat, silver hair gleaming faintly in the weak sunlight. The once confident mayor now looked like a man cornered, his composure cracking with each step as the officers approached the podium. Detective Harris stepped forward, voice firm but calm. "Luther Grant," he said clearly, his words carrying across the silent square, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and fraud." The mayor opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, he stood frozen as the officers took his arms, fastening cold steel cuffs around his wrists. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, shock, shame, and, finally, relief. Caleb lowered the journal onto the podium, his gloved hand resting over it briefly as he glanced back at Lila. Her cheeks were wet, but she met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope where only fear had lived before. The chapter closes as the crowd begins to disperse slowly, the tension easing into quiet reflection. Snow drifts lazily in the cold air, and Caleb stands with Rex at his side, Nora packing away the evidence. Across the square, Luther Grant is led into a waiting car, the weight of 5 years of lies finally cracking beneath the truth. 3 months had passed since the day the truth reshaped North Hollow. Winter's grip had finally loosened, and though patches of snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of rooftops, the air carried the first hints of spring. Birds called faintly from the tall pine trees bordering the northern road, their voices weaving softly into the breeze. Where the old rotting wooden cabin once stood, a place haunted by hunger and silence, stood something entirely new. A 2-story building of warm cedar and white trim, its wide front porch lined with freshly planted wildflowers. A wooden sign hung proudly above the entrance, carved carefully with steady hands, Holloway Memorial Home. A place for the forgotten. The center had been Caleb's vision, brought to life with the help of Nora Caldwell, the county hospital, and volunteers from across the state. It served as a free community center for abandoned and underprivileged children, offering shelter, food, and education. The funding came from donations sparked after Luther Grant's arrest, when the truth about his corruption spread beyond the borders of North Hollow. Where once the Holloway name was whispered like a curse, it now stood as a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and survival. Caleb stood beneath the carved sign, dressed in a dark gray buttoned shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His broad shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. His blue-gray eyes, once shadowed by grief, now carried a calm steadiness. Beside him, Rex lay stretched out in the grass, his thick black and tan coat glinting faintly beneath the soft sunlight. The German shepherd's ears twitched as children laughed nearby, a small smile seeming to settle naturally across his alert expression. In the months since the square, Rex had become more than Caleb's partner. He had become the silent guardian of the center, a symbol to the people of North Hollow, a reminder of resilience and loyalty. Lila ran across the courtyard, her once thin frame now filling out, her cheeks flushed with warmth instead of cold. She wore a clean light blue dress and a matching ribbon in her long brown hair, which bounced lightly as she moved. Clutched in her small hands was a carefully folded piece of paper, edges creased where she'd held it too tightly. At 10 paces away, she stopped, shy for just a moment, her hazel eyes glimmering beneath the early spring light. "Caleb," she said softly, her voice carrying through the quiet hum of the afternoon. He knelt down to meet her at eye level, a gentle smile touching his face. "What is it, kiddo?" She hesitated, then unfolded the paper and handed it to him with both hands. The drawing, done in colored pencils, showed a small wooden house standing amid soft white snow. In front of it stood 3 figures and a German shepherd, a tall man with dark hair, a girl in a red coat, and a smaller boy holding the dog's paw. Across the top of the page, in shaky but proud handwriting, were the words, "Our home." Caleb's throat tightened as he stared at the drawing, his breath slow and heavy, emotions pressing deep into his chest. His rough hand brushed the paper's edge carefully, like holding something fragile. When he finally looked up, Lila's tentative smile broke into a real one for the first time, a soft, trembling curve, unburdened by fear. Behind them, Noah Holloway, now 5, sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a soft green hoodie 2 sizes too big for him. His pale cheeks had regained some color, and his breathing came steady now, thanks to months of consistent treatment. He kicked his small boots against the wooden steps, watching the other children playing in the yard. Beside him sat Mrs. Green, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a straw sun hat, a warm scarf looped around her shoulders. Though she still worked part-time at the hospital, Mrs. Green now visited the center every afternoon to check on Noah's lungs and make sure his treatment stayed on track. Nora stood nearby, her navy trench coat swaying gently with the breeze, her blonde hair pulled into a neat braid today. She had a soft notebook in hand, jotting details for a long-form piece she was preparing for the Glenmore Gazette. It wasn't just about Luther Grant's corruption. It was about what came after, the rebuilding, the restoration of trust between the people and the children they had once abandoned. She glanced toward Caleb and smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of the countless nights spent planning, arguing, and rebuilding. Further down the pathway, a tall man approached, his gait slow but deliberate. It was Garrett Myers, his once burly frame now a little leaner but steady, his graying hair trimmed short. His soot-marked hands still carried the memory of battles fought in silence. Garrett had joined the center's construction crew as soon as the project began, helping frame the walls and lay the foundation. Now, standing on the courtyard's edge, his brown eyes shone with something that looked very close to redemption. "You built it," Garrett said quietly when he reached Caleb, his gravelly voice tinged with disbelief. "You actually built it." Caleb turned the drawing in his hand, then folded it carefully before placing it into his jacket pocket. "We built it," he corrected softly, his gaze steady. Garrett's eyes dropped to Rex, who rolled lazily onto his side in the grass, enjoying the warmth of the early spring sun. "Guess even the dog gets credit," Garrett muttered, though his lips curved slightly, something Caleb hadn't seen in years. By noon, the opening ceremony began. People from all corners of North Hollow gathered in the courtyard, bundled in sweaters and scarves, their expressions softer than they had been in years past. Families stood beside one another, strangers clasped hands, and laughter replaced the bitter silences that had once defined the square. Even Mrs. Mullins stood near the back, her stiff posture relaxed, an unspoken apology hanging in her downturned gaze. Caleb stepped onto the wooden podium again, Rex at his side, his deep voice carrying gently through the cool air. "This place," he said, gesturing behind him, "is more than walls and rooms. It's a promise that no child here will ever be left behind again." Applause rippled softly, carried on the spring wind. Caleb glanced back at Lila and Noah, standing near the front, their small hands clasped together. For the first time, he saw not 2 frightened children abandoned by their town, but 2 survivors standing at the beginning of a life filled with possibility. The ceremony closed with quiet cheers, and as the crowd dispersed, Lila tugged gently at Caleb's sleeve. He crouched down as she whispered something close to his ear. "We are not scared anymore," she said simply, her small smile lighting her entire face. Caleb rested a hand gently on her shoulder, nodding once, the edges of his lips curling softly. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest lifted slightly. The chapter closes with the sound of children's laughter blending into the soft whistle of the wind through the pines as Rex lay peacefully at the foot of the Holloway Memorial Home. Above the entrance, the sunlight glinted off the carved letters, a name once stained now etched in hope. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as lightning in the sky. They arrive quietly, carried in the hands of ordinary people choosing not to turn away. Lila and Noah were saved not because the world suddenly became fair, but because one man, one dog, and one community decided to believe in second chances. Through faith, compassion, and courage, broken hearts can heal, families can be rebuilt, and names once forgotten can shine again. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or abandoned, remember this: God has not forgotten you. His timing is perfect, and His blessings often come disguised as strangers, helping hands, or the quiet strength to keep going one more day. Let us pray together that every child without warmth finds shelter, that every broken home finds peace, and that every lost soul finds its way back into God's light. If this story touched your heart, help us spread hope. Comment below and share your thoughts or prayers for children like Lila and Noah. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of faith, hope, and second chances. Share this video so that together we can remind the world God's love is never ending and His miracles are everywhere. May God bless you, your family, and every child still waiting for their miracle.